Over 16 days in September 1941, 665,000 Soviet soldiers disappeared into the largest military encirclement ever executed. To grasp that number, picture every man, woman, and child in wartime Washington, D.C. surrounded, cut off, and annihilated inside a stretch of Ukrainian steppe no larger than Rhode Island. While those soldiers fought and perished, Hitler and his senior commanders fought a parallel war among themselves over whether this stunning victory had just cost Germany everything. The Battle of Kiev was not a single narrative, but three colliding into one catastrophe. It was a tactical triumph that produced a strategic disaster. It was Stalin's deadly rigidity colliding with Hitler's ideological obsession. And it was the moment when military genius became the instrument of genocidal massacre, exposing the true character of this war. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, weapons, and doctrine, subscribe now. Turn on notifications and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. On August 21, 1941, Adolf Hitler ordered the diversion of Army Group Center's panzer forces southward toward Kiev, choosing the conquest of Ukraine over a direct thrust at Moscow. Most of the Wehrmacht's senior operational commanders opposed him. Heinz Guderian, commanding the 2nd Panzer Group, argued passionately for pressing the attack on the Soviet capital. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock cautioned that pulling the panzers away would surrender the strategic initiative at the moment it mattered most. Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, documented his fierce objections in his war diary. The prevailing view among Germany's professional officer corps was clear. Moscow, they believed, was the nucleus of Soviet power, the nexus of the railway system, the political heart that Stalin would defend at any price. Seize Moscow and the war might be over. Divert to Kiev and the opportunity would vanish. Hitler summoned Guderian for a private conference on August 23rd. The panzer commander laid out his case with precision. Army Group Center had advanced to within 220 miles of Moscow after the victories at Minsk and Smolensk. More than 320,000 Soviet prisoners had fallen at Minsk in June and July. Another 300,000 had been captured at Smolensk through July. The Red Army formations guarding Moscow were staggering. The roads forward lay open. Every day wasted gave the Soviets time to fortify, to mobilize reserves, to transform the capital into an impregnable stronghold. Guderian insisted that striking now, while the enemy reeled, was the sole path to victory before winter. Hitler dismissed the argument. His reasoning was ideological and economic. Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, the source of grain that would sustain the Reich and deny sustenance to the Soviets. The Donbass industrial basin supplied the coal and steel that drove Soviet war production. Seizing these assets was the economic foundation of Lebensraum. Beyond economics, Hitler demanded the destruction of Soviet armies, not simply their displacement. Encircling the forces defending Kiev would neutralize the threat to Army Group South's exposed flank and clear the path toward the Caucasus oil fields. The capital could wait. Guderian yielded. He had no alternative, but his memoirs preserve the depth of his bitterness. By August 1941, the fractures in the German war machine were already visible. Supply lines stretched more than 1,000 kilometers from rail terminals in Poland. The roads dissolved into mire at the first rainfall. Infantry trailed days behind the panzers. Fuel shortages immobilized entire formations. Guderian's own dispatches cataloged vehicles abandoned for lack of parts, tanks failing faster than they could be repaired, and troops worn down by 2 months of continuous combat. The blitzkrieg that had shattered France in 6 weeks was colliding with the vastness of Russia and an enemy that refused to break. Yet, Hitler directed the panzers south, and south they went. But 800 kilometers away, another leader was making choices that would condemn more than 500,000 of his own soldiers. What was Stalin seeing that his field commanders could not? Semyon Budyonny oversaw the defense of Ukraine at the theater level. Mikhail Kirponos commanded the southwestern front directly responsible for holding Kiev. Both understood operational realities. By late August, they could see the trap forming. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was driving south. Paul von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group was preparing to strike north from a bridgehead at Kremenchug. The two armored forces were converging, and the Soviet armies defending Kiev sat squarely between them. The geometry was elementary and lethal. If the pincers linked, more than 500,000 troops would be sealed in a ring with their backs against the Dnieper. Budyonny requested authorization to pull back. Stalin denied it. On September 12th, Kirponos transmitted an urgent dispatch. The front was disintegrating. German armor was pouring through breaches in the lines. He appealed for permission to execute a fighting withdrawal. Stalin's answer was unequivocal: hold Kiev at all costs. On September 13th, Budyonny sent his own desperate plea. Stalin removed him from command, replacing him with Semyon Timoshenko. The directive did not change. Stalin's refusal was not military. It was psychological. Throughout the 1930s, he had gutted the Red Army's officer corps, executing or imprisoning thousands of experienced commanders. The survivors learned that independent thinking was punished, withdrawal equaled treason, and treason meant execution. Stalin's command style paralyzed decision-making at every echelon. Officers waited for explicit orders because acting without authorization could end with a bullet. Even when the situation demanded retreat, no one dared order it without Stalin's personal consent. Isolated in Moscow, deeply mistrustful of his generals, Stalin convinced himself the German southward push was a feint. He was wrong on every count. On September 16th, the pincers snapped shut at Lokhvitsa, 150 kilometers east of Kiev. Guderian's armor driving south linked with Kleist's armor driving north. The following day, Stalin authorized withdrawal. The permission arrived exactly one day after it ceased to matter. Kirponos tried to organize a breakout. It was hopeless. German forces had already consolidated a continuous encirclement perimeter. Roads were choked with wrecked vehicles. Command structures collapsed. Kirponos himself was killed on September 20th, fighting through the German cordon near the village of Shumakovo. He died executing an order that arrived too late, a commander who diagnosed the trap but was forbidden to evade it. The catastrophe was total. How did the Germans execute the largest encirclement in the history of warfare? Guderian launched his southward drive in late August from positions along the Desna River, more than 200 kilometers north of Kiev. The advance sliced through Soviet defenses oriented to resist a westward assault, not a blow from the north. Panzer divisions exploited gaps, bypassed strongpoints, and plunged deep into the rear. They advanced faster than Soviet commanders could react, faster than orders could travel through the paralyzed chain of command. Intercepted radio traffic gave German officers real-time intelligence. The Luftwaffe shattered counterattacks before they could gather momentum. Guderian's tanks covered the distance in under 2 weeks. Simultaneously, Kleist struck northward from the bridgehead at Kremenchug, secured through a daring crossing of the Dnieper. The two panzer formations executed a double envelopment spanning hundreds of kilometers, with limited direct coordination between converging spearheads, relying heavily on the operational plan and the initiative of subordinate leaders. On September 16th, forward elements of the 3rd Panzer Division from Guderian's column met reconnaissance troops from the 16th Panzer Division of Kleist's column at Lokhvitsa. The ring was closed. Trapped within were the Soviet 5th, 21st, 26th, and 37th Armies, along with rear echelons, supply trains, and civilians. Approximately 665,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest encirclement in the annals of warfare. German troops described scenes exceeding comprehension, mile upon mile of abandoned equipment, columns of prisoners stretching to the horizon, so vast that the head of the column reached German processing stations, while the tail still stood deep inside the contracting pocket. Roads jammed with horses, guns, trucks, and men in total disorder. Some Soviet soldiers resisted with suicidal resolve. Others surrendered in enormous masses, leaderless and overwhelmed. By September 26th, when organized resistance ceased, the Germans tallied more than 600,000 prisoners, at least 100,000 killed, and roughly 10,000 escaped. More than 3,000 tanks and over 3,700 artillery pieces were destroyed or captured. The Soviet Southwestern Front ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. To appreciate the magnitude, the Minsk pocket had yielded 300,000 prisoners, the Smolensk pocket another 300,000. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, among history's most famous battles, would yield only 91,000. Kiev eclipsed them all. But as Guderian's spent panzers sat amid the wreckage, the calendar read early autumn, and Moscow lay 450 kilometers north. Had Hitler's wager succeeded, or had Germany just won a battle while forfeiting the war? The Kiev operation consumed 4 to 6 weeks. Operation Typhoon did not launch until October 2nd, driving the Moscow offensive squarely into the autumn Rasputitsa. The mud season descended in mid-October as the spearheads were building momentum. Tanks sank into the mire. Trucks buried themselves to their axles. Supply convoys halted entirely. Panzer divisions that had covered 50 kilometers daily in summer now struggled to manage 5. Infantry slogged through knee-deep muck, boots disintegrating, stamina drained by cold and exhaustion. The Luftwaffe discovered its forward airstrips had become swamps, grounding aircraft at the moment they were most needed. The delay was not merely calendar days. Guderian's divisions had driven 200 kilometers south, fought a major encirclement, then retraced their path north. Tanks that had logged thousands of kilometers since June were breaking down at accelerating rates. Spare parts had ceased to exist. The army that attacked Moscow in October bore little resemblance to the force that had torn through Soviet defenses in June. It was depleted, understrength, and running on nothing. Then winter arrived. November delivered freezing temperatures the Germans were unprepared to endure. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and newspaper for insulation. Engines refused to turn over. Weapons froze solid. Frostbite casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. By early December, reconnaissance patrols glimpsed the Kremlin spires through field glasses. Then, the Soviet counteroffensive struck and the advance became a retreat. A substantial body of historians contends the Kiev delay may have cost Germany its last plausible chance at Moscow. If the panzers had pressed forward from Smolensk in August, they might have reached Moscow in early September, ahead of the mud, ahead of winter, ahead of the Siberian reserves. Others, David Stahl notably among them, argue that logistical exhaustion and stiffening Soviet resistance meant Moscow would likely have fallen beyond reach regardless. The counterfactual cannot be settled, but the prevailing view inclines toward the judgment that the delay critically undermined German prospects for swift victory. The operational masterpiece at Kiev had set the stage for the strategic disaster at Moscow. But the true price of Kiev would be measured beyond squandered weeks. Inside the conquered city, another operation was about to commence, one revealing the fundamental nature of this war. Kiev fell on September 19th. German troops entered to cheering from Ukrainian nationalists who regarded the Wehrmacht as liberators. That delusion survived 10 days. On September 29th and 30th, SS Brigadeführer Otto Rasch, commanding Einsatzgruppe C, together with Sonderkommando 4A and elements of the Sixth Army, organized the murder of 33,771 Jews at a ravine called Babi Yar. The victims were summoned under the pretense of resettlement, marched to the ravine, forced to strip, and shot. The killing proceeded for 2 days without pause. The SS logged the death count with bureaucratic precision. This was policy. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile extermination squads with the explicit mandate to murder Jews, communists, and designated enemies. Their operations were coordinated with military authorities who provided logistics, security, and direct participation. The link between the battle and the massacre was immediate and causal. The encirclement destroyed the defending forces. The fall delivered the city to occupation. The occupation enabled genocide. Military conquest and extermination were sequential phases of the same operation. The 600,000 captured soldiers confronted a fate nearly as savage. German policy toward Soviet prisoners was explicitly exterminatory. The OKW and OKH issued directives stipulating minimal rations and no medical care, part of the EDSRCR hunger plan to extract food from occupied territory by starving the population and captives alike. Rations were set at starvation levels, often well under 1,000 calories per day. Prisoners were confined in open-air camps called dulags with no shelter, no sanitation, and no protection from the elements. Disease proliferated unchecked. Men perished from dysentery, typhus, exposure, and outright starvation. Of the hundreds of thousands captured in 1941, Kiev's prisoners among them, more than half were dead by spring of 1942. Over the entire war, more than 3 million of 5.7 million Soviet prisoners perished in German custody, a mortality rate exceeding 50%. Western Allied prisoner mortality fell below 5%. The difference was not logistics, it was ideology. Nazi doctrine classified Slavic peoples as subhuman. The Battle of Kiev was not merely the largest encirclement in history. It was a window into the Nazi war in the East, where operational brilliance served exterminatory objectives. The fall of Kiev led directly to Babi Yar. The capture of prisoners led directly to their deaths. This was not a conventional war. It was a war of annihilation, and every operational success advanced that purpose. But what does this fusion of military genius and genocidal horror reveal about the war itself? Fedor von Bock, who had championed the Moscow assault throughout August, maintained until his death that the Kiev diversion was a strategic calamity. He believed Moscow could have been taken in September. He could never prove the counterfactual, but the majority of senior commanders shared his judgment. Semyon Budyonny, who had seen the encirclement forming and begged for withdrawal, was stripped of command for his prescience. He survived the war, unlike many Soviet commanders who retreated without authorization. His survival owed to his personal bond with Stalin, but his reputation never recovered. He became emblematic of the old guard, a man whose instincts proved sound, but who lacked the authority to act on them. The survivors of the pocket recounted stories of chaos and abandonment. Officers vanished or were killed. Soldiers formed small bands and attempted breakouts. Most were captured. A scattered few slipped through by traveling at night and living off the land. Those who escaped described wounded comrades abandoned because they could not keep pace. Civilians caught in the maelstrom fleeing east. German aircraft strafing columns of refugees and soldiers without distinction. The survivors recounted the moment of capture. German soldiers herding prisoners by the thousands, stripping them of valuables, marching them west toward the dulags. The captives understood what awaited them: starvation, disease, death. These individual fates, from Hitler's ideological wager to Kirponos's death inside the pocket, to the 33,771 murdered at Babi Yar, were not discrete tragedies, but interconnected consequences of the same strategic decisions. What then is the final verdict? By every operational metric, Kiev was a triumph that vindicated German armored doctrine. But the operation may also have been the decision that cost Germany the war. The battle illustrates how Hitler's ideological imperatives consistently overrode military logic. The generals wanted Moscow because it was the strategic center. Hitler demanded Ukraine because it served his racial and economic program. The conquest of Lebensraum, the subjugation of Slavic populations, and the extraction of resources were foundational to the invasion. That collision between military professionalism and ideological fanaticism defined the German war effort and contributed to its downfall. Stalin's command paralysis, born of the purges, would cost millions of lives before institutional reform enabled eventual victory. Commanders awaited explicit authorization rather than exercising independent judgment. When orders proved wrong or arrived too late, entire armies were obliterated. The pattern of catastrophe at Minsk, Smolensk, Vyazma, Bryansk, and Kiev shifted only when Stalin was compelled to grant his generals operational latitude. The Soviet triumph was achieved despite Stalin's command philosophy, not because of it. The Kiev dilemma crystallized Germany's fundamental strategic impossibility. The Reich lacked the resources to achieve all objectives simultaneously. Capturing Moscow, conquering Ukraine, strangling Leningrad, and seizing the Caucasus demanded more divisions, more armor, more fuel, and more time than Germany possessed. The logistical overextension was unmistakable by August 1941. Supply networks could not sustain the advance, infantry could not close the gap with the panzers, fuel deficits paralyzed entire corps. The Wehrmacht was prosecuting a war of extermination, guaranteeing total Soviet resistance, yet lacked the means to sustain operations across a front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Kiev operation succeeded tactically, but failed strategically because it consumed time and assets that were irreplaceable. The operational brilliance obscured the underlying truth that Germany was losing the war of attrition from the moment the first soldier crossed the frontier. The Battle of Kiev endures as a monument to a terrible truth. In war, the most brilliant tactical performance can serve the most ruinous strategic vision. Military history cannot be separated from moral history. Within those 16 days, we witnessed not merely the largest encirclement ever accomplished, but a microcosm of the entire Nazi war in the East, operationally masterful, strategically self-destructive, morally abhorrent. The 665,000 who vanished into the pocket, the 33,771 murdered at Babi Yar, and the German soldiers who won the battle but helped pave the road to ultimate defeat, all bear witness to the same lesson. Brilliance in execution counts for nothing when it serves a vision founded on madness and atrocity. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.